Alessandra Navidad, the Executive Director of the ACLU of Arizona. Alessandra has served as Executive Director at the ACLU since 2006. And she was the first Latina to head the ACLU in Arizona. And she was raised in a trilingual household with a Brazilian mother and an Argentine father. And so she knew Spanish, and she learned Portuguese from her Brazilian mother. And I think she's got enough English to be able to pull this presentation off today. So because of her pretty varied background here, Alessandra learned a lot about human rights from her parents. And those values that she learned from them of equality and fairness, of course, form the core of the work that she's been doing for the ACLU, not just here in Arizona. She started with the ACLU of Florida. I'm sorry, with the ACLU of Louisiana. And then she went to the ACLU for Florida. And before that, Alessandra worked as a journalist. She was a reporter for the Miami Herald and the Roanoke Times. As I mentioned, she's fluent in Spanish and Portuguese, and of course English, and is the mother of a teenage boy, and I think identical twin. I think they're still preteen, aren't they, Alessandra? They're not.
They are, right?
Yeah.
12, still preteen.
The 12, 13, yeah, so they're identical twin girls. Alessandra holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Florida, and an MBA from University of Arizona's Eller College of Management. So on a personal note, I want to just mention that I had the immense pleasure and honor of serving on the board of the ACLU of Arizona, part of the time as president, working with Alessandra. So I had a firsthand window into how she operates. So it is no surprise to me that her leadership at the ACLU of Arizona has been coincident with a very substantial growth, not just in the size, but in the amount of activity the ACLU has had in Arizona. And so I'm really pleased that we have the opportunity to welcome Alessandra here today to tell us about the ACLU program. So Alessandra.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zenaido. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and it's wonderful to be live on Facebook and to be with all of you. I think you should all be, the Arizona Secular Coalition should be extremely proud of the work that they have been doing over the past, I think it's what, five years. It is the only staffed secular coalition in the country, in the States. And so I think that's a testament to your great work and to the support and the investment in that really important secular voice. So thank you, Zenaido. And, as Zenaido mentioned, he cycled off the board in March and everything's really gone to hell since then. So we miss you. In all seriousness, this is the first time I've given a sort of a Zoom presentation for this amount of time. So I typically don't use PowerPoints, but I did feel like you might need some additional visuals over the next hour, like other than the rooster in my home office. So I'm going to share my screen here so that everybody can see the PowerPoint. Oh, I need host disabled participant screen sharing. Is there a way that I could share the screen, Tori? Maybe I should request. Oh, here we go. Okay, perfect. Thank you. And let's see. Okay, here we go. So let me just cycle off there. So I wanted to just kind of start off by taking the time to really acknowledge the pain and frustration and really loss of hope that many people across the country are feeling right now. George Floyd was killed at the hands of Minneapolis police officer who smashed his head and neck down into the street for an entire 9 minutes, all of which was captured on camera. And, the video is extremely, extremely difficult to watch. And, you can hear him, you can hear Floyd saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," which were the precise words of Eric Garner, who also died at the hands of police in 2014. And you can see the life being crushed out of this man. You can see almost every bit of it. And by the time the ambulance got there, he was gone. On midday Friday, Minneapolis police charged the officer with third-degree murder. They've subsequently, the AG there has increased those charges to second-degree murder since then. And the officer, along with the other 3 officers who stood there and watched, also have been charged with lower-level aiding and abetting charges. And the FBI has made it a top priority. But, as a woman of color with, with no accent and somebody who is white presenting, I really have no way of knowing what it's like to live in constant fear of being killed by police. But what I can tell you is that, we train our kids. The ACLU constantly tells the public in our Know Your Rights materials, stay calm, don't resist, don't obstruct the officers, speak respectfully. There was absolutely nothing George Floyd could have done to change the outcome. There was no space for him. As a direct result, he's now dead. So, protests across the country in response to George Floyd's killing, it feels, people are responding because it really does feel like open season on Black people in this country. As you all also know, Deon Johnson was also shot and killed by a DPS officer on Monday after falling asleep in his car, and they still have not released the name of that officer. So I want to use this as an opportunity to really reflect on the ACLU's work on policing. We issued a statement on Thursday calling for a fair, independent, and transparent investigation, and also calling for a ban on chokeholds, which are banned in many police departments across the country because they cut off the flow of oxygen and quickly render a person unconscious. So our work, the ACLU's work on policing really dates back to decades. And we were very much involved in the, riots in Newark from the 1960s, dating all the way to the abuses that we saw in Ferguson. And my first job, as Senaido mentioned, my first job at the ACLU was actually in New Orleans in the late 90s, which is really the home of one of the most corrupt and brutal police departments in the country. I've worked in Miami, I've worked in Phoenix, and throughout my tenure at the ACLU, we've been very much involved in the sort of accountability and transparency piece. I've helped create civilian oversight boards with subpoena power. We've secured court orders, consent decrees, mandating these systemic reforms through litigation. We've won large damage awards on behalf of families of loved ones. We've documented abuses. We've done, legal observer training, all of this to say that none of these efforts have changed the culture of lawlessness within those departments. And so I think for that reason, it's really kind of forced us to rethink policing in the 21st century. The reality is that the litigation and the courts are not the panacea. We all have the power of the purse. We're the taxpayers. We have the power to really advocate for complete rethinking of policing. The courts have basically, for many, many years, failed to bring justice to the victims. If you want to sue a police officer who violated your rights, you have to show that that officer knowingly violated the law, and it's extremely, extremely difficult. So one of the things we're calling for is reinvestment in savings from current policing budgets into alternative policing that supports the community's schools and public health. And so the other big piece of the work that we've been doing is really trying to decarcerate and work with the police. Jerry Williams in March announced that she was not going to be booking people for nonviolent offenses as a result of COVID. Because she didn't want to increase the jail population with nonviolent folks who are there for nonviolent offenses. And then obviously that's changed, in the last couple of days, where we have lots of people who are being arrested for nonviolent offenses, violating curfew because of the protests and in response to the protests. And so one of the things we're doing is trying to leverage those pronouncements by the police departments to kind of continue to enforce those policies so that we can see a reduction in the number of people behind bars. So the largest piece of our work, I kind of started off saying that litigation is not the panacea, but the ACLU is a legal organization, right? And so that is how we have been able to obtain, at the very least, sort of short-term changes and reforms to police departments. MCSO, for example, is the primary example, right? After 12 years of litigation, we were able to get a decision from the court mandating a series of court reforms. This is what we're trying to do with to hold the Phoenix Police Department accountable. This is a department, it's one of the most brutal departments in the country. It has one of the highest numbers of shootings in the country. We filed a lawsuit in 2018 challenging the use of pepper spray and tear gas against protesters. And this was at the August 2017 protest. And that case is continuing. What we did over the weekend was we sent our attorneys to document and to gather more evidence showing that the police department is using tear gas, for example, as a disbursement mechanism. They're attacking mostly peaceful protesters rather than, in the name of sort of maintaining order, rather than, addressing the few problem protesters, they're essentially tear gassing and pepper spraying everyone. And so some of the things that we're trying to seek through the litigation is court-ordered reforms, saying that they not only need to warn protesters, but to end that sort of tactic of firing weapons at all of the protesters. So I want to kind of talk a little bit now about the ACLU's COVID-19 rapid response work. One of the things that we have been able to do was kind of quickly pivot when COVID became, was designated a pandemic, and this was in early March. We had been working up until now over the past couple of years to decarcerate our jails and prisons and our immigration detention centers. So we were able to easily pivot after COVID to really push for these elected officials, push for these government entities to try to release people. And we have released across the country over 20,000 people as a result of about 120 legal actions that we've taken across the country. Most of those are focused on, prisons and jails. 44 of them are focused on immigration detention. 10 of them are focused on access to voting. Those are the three main bucket areas. It's prisons, reducing the number of people that are in prison who are elderly and at higher risk of contracting COVID. Recently here in Arizona, we filed a lawsuit against Core Civic, challenging and asking for the release of highly vulnerable detainees, including people who haven't even been charged, like a mother, for example, of 3 who's suffering from cancer, to who's there because she's a civil immigration detainee, to have those folks released. And another lawsuit that we've been doing some advocacy with the Tucson sector, for example, to take steps to suspend enforcement activities as a result of COVID. And in addition, we worked with the Florence Project to seek the release of 8 highly vulnerable detainees in civil immigration detention who are at high risk of contracting the disease. So I thought it would be, given the interest in, secularism and government intrusions on our right to practice a religion or practice no religion at all. I thought it was really interesting. I wanted to talk a little bit now about how the sort of a movement that we've seen among religious organizations to challenge many of these stay-at-home orders. The ACLU has, we get a lot of calls, like after the stay-at-home orders and the shelter-in-place orders went into place, I started getting a lot of calls from reporters. We generally have not, opposed these, what we call kind of content-neutral social distancing restrictions. The government typically is going to balance those competing interests, the right to protest and the right to worship and those public health interests. And we generally have not opposed them because we thought that the government would have a legitimate argument to say that they're restricting some of these activities in order to protect the public. But what I thought was really interesting, which I wanted to share with all of you, is that there have been 40 lawsuits as of May 28th. So as of last week, there have been 40 lawsuits that have been filed by churches, religious groups, and individuals arguing that the right to worship has been violated by these bans. Mostly all of those have been rejected by the courts. And so, about 14 of those were rejected based off of, standing. There have been a small number of those where the courts have said, okay, you could do drive-in worship services because you're able to social distance. But I think the reality is, and what we've seen is that the courts have generally rejected those arguments in the interest of maintaining public safety. And so the same types, there also have been similar types of lawsuits challenging the protest bans. And as of May 27th, most of those, there have been 6 orders denying the protesters' request for relief. And so, in most of those cases, the government has argued that those restrictions were content neutral, and that, again, that there were other ways for people to express themselves, either online or through drive-in protests. And so the courts found that, it wasn't violating or compromising those rights. I thought it was really interesting. I want to just highlight one case that our affiliate in New York filed, seeking a TRO against New York's order restricting public gatherings, because the restriction of public gatherings basically had a huge exception for people who were attending a religious service or ceremony, as long as they followed social distancing requirements. And so we sued, arguing that the state was prioritizing religious worship over protest, and we won. We got a decision from the court basically saying that that was the case, and the state later amended the order to allow gatherings of up to 10 people. So I thought that was worth sort of mentioning there. So I wanted to kind of move topics or change topics here and talk a little bit about the ACLU's work on our county attorney campaign. The ACLU, as many of you know, does not oppose or endorse candidates. It's a position that we've had for over 100 years. And actually, no, throughout our entire 100-year history. But we are this year, and we have been over the last couple of years, doing more work, electoral work, really educating people about the civil liberties records and the civil liberties policies that are either rejected or supported by candidates. So to provide the public with a little bit of an inventory of how these candidates feel on the issues that are important to the ACLU. And so, as I mentioned, one of our goals is to decarcerate, to reduce the number of people behind bars. Arizona has the 5th highest incarceration rate in the country. And so we've been pushing to eliminate the racial disparities in the prison system and actually try to pass laws that allow people to earn release time for participating in programs and for good behavior. Some of those bills have received, bipartisan support over the last couple of years, but we have not been able to get anything substantively passed out of the Arizona legislature, which is probably no surprise to any of you who are participating. And the primary opponent to those measures is the county attorney, right? The Maricopa County Attorney and the Pima County Attorney's Office. They have opposed all of our efforts to reform sentencing laws in order to reduce the prison population. And so that's one of the primary reasons we believe that the MCAO is the primary sort of the barrier to getting substantive reforms out of the Arizona legislature. And so we wanted to spend a little time really educating voters about the importance of the county attorney race. And so I mentioned we have the 5th highest incarceration rate in the country. We spend over $1.1 billion on our prison system. We have longer sentences than any other state, and Black and Latinx people are impacted disproportionately. We have the largest number of Latinx people who are detained in the country. And we have seen, since 2000, there's been a 60% increase in the number of people behind bars, despite the fact that crimes have decreased. So, the it's a real serious issue, and we think that, you know, again, it's the county attorney race is typically one of the races is a down ballot race. Not everybody votes in that race. There were thousands and thousands of undervotes in 2016 for this very, very important race. And so we're hoping that we could see an increase in the number of people who cast ballots in 2020. So I did want to mention, you know, not only do we have the 5th highest incarceration rate in the country, but people are serving 31% longer sentences than they were in 2009. And again, you know, we have less crime. Crime continues to decrease. 1 in 5 people in Arizona prisons are serving time for drug-related offenses, and in 2017, marijuana-related charges dominated prison admissions. So, you know, in the last 3 decades, this $1.1 billion price tag, what we've seen, that is 241% more than what we were spending 3 decades ago. And it's obviously more than what we spend on education. So I want to talk a little bit about what the county attorney is, right? It's basically the county attorney is sort of the chief prosecutor who is elected by the people. The county attorney serves 4 years, and you know, it's essentially, we believe, one of the most powerful actors in the criminal justice system. That county attorney decides who goes to prison and for how long and for how many years. And so this, the Maricopa County attorney for you know, during the past 4 or 5 years has really fueled the growth in the prison population that we've seen that has absolutely devastated families. 90% of all of the cases are resolved by plea deal, which means that most people do not go to trial. Prosecutors typically are overcharging people, or they're threatening to overcharge them, which is why it's just how they negotiate the plea deals. And many times we have documented through data that they are seeking bail, higher bail amounts on people based on race and ethnicity, and that they are seeking bail on indigent defendants who cannot afford to post bail, which is in violation of the Arizona Constitution. So this is a picture of one of our, Carmen, one of our awesome volunteers whose son is serving a 7-year sentence for trafficking in stolen property for selling a laptop that he did not realize was stolen. He had a prior, he's somebody who's been suffering from a drug addiction for many, many years, and because he had a prior, he is now serving a 7-year sentence. So here's some, I wanted to just talk real briefly about the Maricopa County's Attorney's Office. You know, this is an entity that has been, you know, it's had a history of corruption and scandal over the years. There are many, many examples. Here's the picture of our former Maricopa County attorney, who's now an Arizona Supreme Court Justice. His name is Bill Montgomery. And then we also have Andrew Thomas, who subsequently has been disbarred for cooperating and collaborating with Arpaio to violate the rights of Latinos in Maricopa County. So I wanted to just talk real briefly, because I think this might interest folks before we open it up to questions. I wanted to talk real briefly about some of the scandals that have made the headlines, because I think there is a direct connection here that demonstrates, you know, the examples of where you have a county attorney who is making policy decisions based on his own personal biases that are related to his own religion, that are related to his belief about marijuana decriminalization, and his lack of you know, really his inability to hold his own prosecutors accountable for numerous unethical behavior. So we saw that Arizona Supreme Court repeatedly found one of Montgomery's top prosecutors, Juan Martinez, was engaged in misconduct in numerous cases. He has subsequently been fired from the department when Alistair Adele, who is now is the incumbent, who replaced Montgomery when he became a Supreme Court justice. You know, Montgomery has been fighting tooth and nail to hide public information from Arizonans about his misconduct. We asked, this was actually more than a year ago, we filed a public records request with his office just to get basic data on the race and ethnicity of the people who were being prosecuted. And they have ignored and stonewalled all of those public records requests. In fact, it wasn't until we filed a lawsuit for violating public records that he started to comply with those records requests. But I think it's really an example of how they're hiding and really failing to be transparent with the public about how their policies and practices are really impacting criminal justice here in Arizona. Everybody knows Montgomery is not a fan of marijuana. He's shown like strong disdain for marijuana, and he called a U.S. veteran and lawful medical marijuana patient an enemy, quote, an enemy for using marijuana. This is even after, you know, the voters actually approved medical marijuana for the use of medical marijuana. He's done everything he can to, for example, refusing to issue zoning documents to dispensaries, and his office is also being sued for using threats of prosecution against people possessing small amounts of marijuana to force them into diversion programs that they can't afford. You know, voters years ago actually passed a measure that says that people should not be, after the first or second conviction for drug possession, receive jail time. And so he's been, you know, deliberately forcing people into this diversion program that costs thousands and thousands of dollars. You may have heard the headlines of Montgomery hiring an anti-Muslim activist named John Rondolo to train the law enforcement officers of the Phoenix Police Department and to train his own county attorneys. This was despite strong opposition by many people in the Muslim community who had argued that this was xenophobic, and it was stoking the racist and discriminatory and creating even more, more pushback to members of the Muslim community. And I think finally, he refused to provide adoption services for same-sex couples, even though Arizona law requires county attorneys to assist with uncontested adoption. So this is just like an example of the, you know, sort of the scandals that we've been dealing with MCAO over the past few years. So here's, you know, as I mentioned, the ACLU does not endorse or oppose candidates. I thought it was important for everybody to kind of see who's running. So we have Bob McWhirter, Alistair O'Dell, Julie Gunnigal, and Will Knight. And Alistair O'Dell was appointed in 2019, and she's is the incumbent who's going to be running. So we are having, for those of you that are interested, excuse me, we're having a town hall on June 17th. I should have put a slide up for everyone, but you can check it out on our website, smartjusticeaz.org, June 17th at 5 o'clock from 5 to 7, a town hall on COVID-19 and just COVID-19 and the work that we're doing as part of this county attorney campaign. So I wanted to just wrap up. I think I have a few more minutes here and open it up to questions. I know I've been covering a lot of stuff here, but what I thought was important for us to talk a little bit about what the world we want, right, and why we're doing this. And so the values that we have been kind of articulating and supporting as part of this county attorney campaign are the values that are surrounding decarceration. We are looking for a county attorney who supports efforts to reduce the prison and jail population. We want somebody who can champion reform at the legislature, who is not actively opposing those bipartisan efforts to reform our sentencing laws. We want somebody who's going to be open and transparent and who, you know, recognizes that there are disparities, race disparities in the system, and who will work to do something about it. We are looking for somebody who will build trust between law enforcement and the community, and somebody who works to keep families together. by, you know, one of the things that the county attorneys are required to do is, before people accept plea deals, is inform defendants of the immigration consequences of those deals. And we know that that does not happen as required by law. And we want somebody who's transparent. You know, I think it's really, really important for us, for the public, to know how these policies or practices are being implemented, and as I mentioned, how they're impacting the number of people who are being sent to prison. So this is a recap. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the County Attorney Campaign, I'd like for you to visit smartjusticeaz.org. And this is my contact information for anyone. But I wanted to, I think my timer here says we have 1 minute left. Is that about right, Zenaido?
I'm gonna have to bring him back.
Okay, sure.
Okay, sorry, I was muted.
All right, Zenaido, let's see.
I'm happy to turn it over for questions, Tori, or if there are other, are there other panelists?
It is you and Zenaido. I should be coming back. I'm trying to bring him back on. There we go.
There he
came
is.
back. There he is.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much, Alessandra. That was certainly a great update, because I know that so much of that has happened in the last few months that I certainly wasn't aware of the vast majority of what you mentioned there. We do have some questions starting to come in. We've got close to 50 people on the Zoom line, and I don't know how many are on Facebook, but I'm expecting that there'll be more questions. But I did have one question I wanted to ask you before I went into the questions that are being asked from the floor. I know that there was a recent announcement based on one of the latest church-state issues that were matters arising out of these demonstrations, with the president going across the street using a Bible for and so on. And I know that the ACLU has recently announced some legal action on that. Do you have any information on that you could share with us?
Sure, yeah, we did, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
We did sue. This is why, which is why I love this organization, because when it comes to sort of correcting and addressing like immediate violations of people's rights, that's what the law and litigation is really, really helpful for. And we sued the next day after, actually we sued on Friday, after the Trump kind of media blitz, where the camera opportunity, where the photo op, where he basically unleashed the federal police force and the military and the Park Service to tear gas the protesters. This was in DC, in Lafayette Square, and we did sue on behalf of Black Lives Matter. And we have also sued in California, in Southern California, challenging the curfew in LA as an example of a tool that was used by the elected officials to stifle free expression, which is, you know, one of the concerns here. I mean, I think for those of you who've been following the arrests, I think the first couple of days, like on Thursday and Friday before the curfew was issued, there were like maybe 30 arrests on Thursday and Friday and Saturday. And then on Sunday, after the curfew was issued, the arrests jumped to 114. Been over 340 arrests. Most of those people were arrested for felony rioting, and most of those charges have been subsequently dismissed because there was no evidence that those people were engaging in violent activity. You know, most of the people were engaging in peaceful protests. And so I think we believe that the curfew is being used as a way to kind of stifle speech. So those are the two lawsuits that were filed recently. Was one in DC after the tear gassing incident in Lafayette Park, and then the one in Southern California.
What was the lawsuit about for Trump? Was that Trump?
The lawsuit that arose out of Trump, the photo opportunity.
Right, that one. Yes, that's the one in Washington, DC.
Okay. All right.
We sued, yes, that's the one where we sued Trump directly. He's one of the defendants, as is William Barr.
Yeah, William Barr has.
I mean, we argued that they deliberately, you know, I mean, that was sort of an effort to stifle the protests, and we sued the federal government directly.
Super. There was a question a minute ago from the floor regarding information. Where can people go for information about not just the county attorneys, but also county candidates for county sheriff? Both those positions are extremely impactful, particularly in all our communities. And there's substantial amount of information available for example, Maricopa County or even maybe Pima County as well. But where can people go to get more information in some of the other counties? We got 15 counties, and
Right. Well, I know that there are other organizations that have been supporting. I know Planned Parenthood has been supporting some of the candidates for county attorney. They do endorse candidates for county attorney, and the Planned Parenthood, and also Arizona list is also looking at endorsing some of those candidates. We have prioritized Maricopa County just because that's where our capacity is. But I know that, for example, Planned Parenthood is looking and endorsing some of those candidates, the county attorney candidates outside of Phoenix. And then for the sheriff, that race, we have heard that Jerry Sheridan is thinking about running, Arpaio is thinking about running again. And as of right now, I'm not sure if they have officially sort of filed, but you're right. I mean, I think this is one of the largest jail systems in the country, and it's an important race.
Thank you. Let me just remind our viewers to click on your Q&A button at the bottom if you have a specific question for Alessandra. It's not every day we have an opportunity to get her to address us. So I'm anxious that if you do have questions that you address them to us. Let me look at the list we have here. Can you tell us how much of the state's prison population is in private versus public institutions? Do barriers to decarcerate differ between the two types of institutions?
So that's a really good question. So I know particularly ACLU members, and this is a really, really big important issue for people because they rightly so are opposing the privatization of prisons. But in Arizona, about 10,000 of our 40,000+ prisoners are in private institutions. So it's a smaller portion of the prison population. And I think what's interesting there is that they're for-profit entities. These are entities that are created to make as much money for their stakeholders as possible. I mean, that's why the corporations are there. And so what they've done is they are typically going to be housing the prisoners who are there for shorter sentences. And they're mostly going to be shorter sentences. They're going to be more of the nonviolent felony offenses that are over a year. And so they are able to cherry pick and have the prisoners that are there for typically the lower level offenses. So so it's 10,000 out of the 40 are in private prisons. And then the other question was, do barriers to decarceration differ between private and public prisons? So I think the answer there would be no. I mean, when we do our advocacy at the legislature and we're calling for, changes to sentencing reform, any changes would also apply to those private prisons because the government has kind of outsourced that function. And so they would still be covered under any changes to the law. But I think one of the other, the concerns in the private prisons also, and in Arizona, one of the big concerns is that the delivery of healthcare has been privatized. And there have been, the courts have identified that as a huge problem. The legislature has. When you're outsourcing delivery of healthcare to an entity that is, is there to maximize its profit, it means the end result is that there are more people who are suffering.
I have some additional questions regard to the incarceration issues, Alessandra, on the talk that we received from Anthony Romero a few days ago, and thank you for inviting us on that talk. For those of you who are not familiar, Anthony Romero is the executive director of the ACLU, National ACLU office, and he had a great webinar that was originally going to be aimed at COVID-19, but within a matter of about a week, he pivoted pretty nicely to focus it all on the demonstrations, and had a number of excellent speakers, primarily from ACLU offices around the country in areas that were affected. And we learned stuff. But one of the things that he mentioned, that I wondered if you had specific information about Arizona, he mentioned that on the order of 5% of the people that are incarcerated across the country actually are in jail for violent offenses. The vast majority are there for nonviolent offenses, or in some cases, stuff that like drug offenses that are relatively minimal impact on society. Can you comment at all how those statistics bear up in Arizona?
So yeah, I mean, it's very similar here in Arizona. The vast majority of folks are there for nonviolent offenses, and they're also, a very large number of them are there for drug possession and drug-related offenses. And so I was actually pulling up, we did a blueprint criminal justice here at the ACLU. It's a really cool report where I'd be happy to put it on the chat box, but if you Google sort of 50-state blueprint ACLU, you'll see the Arizona numbers. Maybe I can put it on here so that everybody can I can put it on the chat. Oh, here we go. I can send it to everyone. Oh, this is cool. So if you click on that, this has all of the Arizona numbers. So as I mentioned, we're a little bit over 40,000, but if you look at click on this, learn about facts, here we go, Arizona. Like most states, Arizona's prison population, I think in here, it breaks it down by the percentages, but I don't know it offhand, but I can pull that for you. And you know, as I said, most of them are there for nonviolent offenses. But what's cool here is that you can basically pick a reform, and then it shows you what the impact of that reform would be. So, for example, if you reform our drug laws to reduce the time served for everyone who's there for drug offenses, you could reduce the prison population by, you know, almost 10,000%. And so you could also download the entire report, and I can pull that up, but I have the exact here. I can tell you the exact number right now. But it's going to be very, very similar to those national numbers.
Another number, Alessandra, that surprised me a little, that Anthony mentioned, is that the average budget for municipalities for public safety and law enforcement is on the order of 30 or 40%. Is that also true in Arizona, pretty much?
I would not be surprised if it is. I don't have those recent numbers, but I mean, I think that would not surprise me if those numbers are also reflected here in Arizona, because what we have seen is that, you know, the public safety budgets and the budgets for the police departments are increased practically every year, while the investments in community programs and community centers and schools and health decreases. And so it's a real problem. And I think what's interesting here is that, you know, it's a new strategy for the ACLU, but it has been something that the local groups here in Arizona have been advocating for the last local grassroots Black and Brown organization, Floyd in Action, for example, and the Black Lives Matter Phoenix group has been advocating for divestment of the police departments for the last 3 years. And, you know, as I said during my presentation, it is, you know, we have that power of the purse as taxpayers. We are the ones who should be pressuring the city council to reduce the funding for those police departments. I mean, you look at the pictures tonight, though, and you have these police departments have been completely militarized. You know, they have tanks, they are showing up in riot gear. I mean, it costs a lot of money, you know, to do all that stuff, right? And so, you know, we should be able to push for that. And I think ultimately, like Minnesota, for example, and Minneapolis is one of the departments now that's sort of seriously considering, you know, reducing the funds, disbanding even its police department, because most of the calls that these police departments are getting, they're for people who are either suffering from mental health issues or drug addiction issues. And even the officers will tell you, they're not, you know, they don't want to be responding to those calls. We should have caseworkers. We should have mental health like counselors and caseworkers and social workers and drug addiction specialists responding to those calls. So I found, if you go to the blueprint here, in Arizona, they're basically, when we look at, the vast majority are for 13% is assault, 22% drug offenses, 12% other offenses, 19% property offenses, and only 34% are there for violent offenses. Those are the recent numbers. But I would urge you, you know, in 2017, most of the Arizona admissions in prison, as I said, over 32% of the prison admissions were for drug possession and distribution.
Okay, yeah, those are certainly numbers that appear to me, at least, to be more reasonable than the ones that Anthony mentioned. But I have another question. Do we have any statistics that correlates the defunding of public education versus the increase in funding for law enforcement agencies? Is there any information available that you're aware of?
You know, the only thing that I have seen is, you know, I've just seen those numbers in terms of like what we spend on a prisoner versus what we spend on a student. But, you know, I don't know of any sort of analysis that's done that sort of looked at that. But I think that that's, you know, I mean, that's a huge problem, right? Is that so here's an example, you know, Arizona has one of the worst counselor to student ratios in the country. Actually, we have the worst, but yet we have one of the higher number of cops in schools. And so, you know, there's right now, I mean, for the past 3 years, you have students who have been pushing to get rid of the school resource officers from the schools and to instead hire counselors. And, you know, but I don't know if there's any, if there's more recent data on the correlation between the two.
Tori, do you have any questions that have come in through the Facebook links?
I think so. Here, let me.
I don't have access.
Hi. Let's see what we have here. So first of all, I want to say that House Minority Leader Charlene Fernandez did chime in on Facebook to thank you for all of your work, Alessandra. She didn't have a question, but she wanted to let you know she was watching and to thank you.
Oh, cool. She's been a wonderful supporter and advocate for that reform.
Yeah, she's wonderful. We appreciate her very much at Secular AZ as well. Let's see. It looks like somebody says, it seems we are seeing a troubling alliance between Christian nationalism and white supremacy. What can we do to keep a counter-alliance between secular, progressive, religious activists and our movements for racial justice in order to counter that? So I guess the question is, what can we be doing to counter racism as part of our
yeah, I mean, I think
nationalism?
that's a great question. And I think one of the best ways that we can be countering that is to recognize the intersectionality of all of these issues and to show up and support the organizations, the local organizations that are doing this work. You know, sort of Black Lives Matter, Poder en Acción. There are Black, you know, bail funds here in Arizona and across the country, because these issues, they are intersectional, right? Because the attacks that we're seeing, for example, from the religious right on women and LGBT, you know, many of those same politicians support sort of the, you know, sort of law and order more funding for police. And these issues are absolutely interconnected. And so I think it's showing up to support these groups. It's, advancing their messaging. I think that, that may sound like it's not going to make an impact, but all of us need other messengers. We can't be the only ones, talking about sort of secularism. And, I was born and I was raised by an atheist dad. And, I got grounded for going to church for 2 weeks, and but I'm also the head of the ACLU, and I recognize that I might not be the best messenger, right? And so we need other sort of non-traditional messengers who can connect the dots for us and help reshape that public narrative.
Thank you so much. I have one more question that came in from Facebook. Let's see. I'm a Native American tribe member in Arizona. How are Natives being focused on? Natives make up a big population in the prisons in Arizona. Does the ACLU help Native lives matter?
We have been, yes. I mean, I think most of the work that we are doing with leaders in the Native American community over the past several years has been focused on education equity. We work with members of Salt River and other tribal leaders who are we've been working out in the East Valley, for example. There are many Native American students in the East Valley who have been pushed out of school. The numbers are just astronomical. In some instances, Native American kids are 10 times more likely to be pushed out of school than their white peers. And so that work has been, we've been doing a lot of good collaborative work with the Native American and tribal leaders on the education front. And your caller or your Facebook listener is right. The Native American population is disproportionately impacted by over-policing, and they're also highly represented in the jail system. But I think there's a lot more work to do. And I think, as I mentioned, kind of identifying those opportunities for collaboration and showing up and supporting our tribal leaders in elevating their messages has been one of the things that we've been working on.
Okay, thank you so much. We're about out of time here. 2:55. So Zenaido, I'm going to close this out, and thank you so much, Alessandra. And he'll be giving you a proper thank you.
Alessandra, yes, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure having you agree to participate in this with us today and to update us on all the work that you and your colleagues have been doing. I want to announce just before we break off that tomorrow there is another presentation in this series. This one is by Aishin Leonard. She has a presentation entitled Transforming Overwhelm and Trauma into Flourishing and Well-Being. That's actually part of the HSGP Sunday Speaker Series. So it will be here tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. And if you go to secularaz.org, you can click on the link there in order to access that presentation tomorrow at 10 a.m. And 2 weeks from now, Saturday, June the 20th at 2 p.m., Dr. Dwight Moore of the Arizona End of Life Options will have a discussion on that topic for us at this time 2 weeks from now. So once again, thank you, Alessandra, for everything you've done for us today and everything you've done for us for the last 12 or 13 years in Arizona.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, and thanks everyone who joined us. We had a steady stream of it looked like about 51 people on our live stream here on Zoom, and then on Facebook it ranged. We had several people come in and out, and it looks like we had a good 30 more there. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.